Moldova, director of the publisher Nestor Istoria, Moscow, St. Petersburg, scientific supervisor of the Russian academic journal Историческая экспертиза, the historical expertise, and member of PoSoCoMeS. It is a big honor for me to introduce one of the leading specialists in the field of memory studies, Professor Stefan Berger. Stefan Berger is full professor of social history and director of the Institute for Social Movements at the Ruhr University in Bochum, Germany. He is also executive chair of the History of the Ruhr Foundation and an honorary professor at Cardiff University in the United Kingdom. Professor Berger is a very prolific author, but I guess he doesn't like to demonstrate that publicly because I didn't manage to find the exhaustive list of his publications on internet. I made a small research and only on Amazon I found about 120 books where Stefan is the author or editor or one of the paper's contributors. Lenin liked to repeat, not quantity but quality, but in the case of Professor Berger, quantity without any doubts turns into quality of excellent research. He made a big contribution in the comparative research of working class and industrialization on national identity and collective memory. Among his most impressive publications, we should notice his and Jeffrey Olick, a large-scale project, A Cultural History of Memory, which was published in 6 volumes by Bloomsbury this year. It coverages the time span from antiquity to our days. Every volume has a standardized structure: politics, time and space, media and technology, science and education, philosophy, religion and history, high culture and popular culture, society, remembering and forgetting. It is an indispensable synthesis for every researcher of collective memory. I would also mention his monograph, The Past and History, National Identity and Historical Consciousness in Modern Europe, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2015. It contains some important insights. Professor Berger explains that in reality, many historians combined academic research with active involvement in politics of memory. They often acted as the state agents who instigated nationalistic feelings, the hate towards foreigners, and finally are responsible, for example, for the unleashing of a bloodbath of the First World War. Especially surprisingly for me, it was to read that historians started to raise a new nationalistic wave in the end of 1980s. Only imagine, it was the epoch when the Berlin Wall was fallen down, and Francis Fukuyama wrote his The End of History. This Professor Berger insight means that our professional corporation is partly responsible for the current nationalistic trend which affected many European countries. 1990s and 2000s were the epoch of memory's globalization, but now we live during the counter-trend of re-nationalization of memory. Every memory researcher realizes how dangerous our current nationalistic tendencies. Are we able to counteract them, or we have a singular option to study that disgusting phenomenon? Professor Berger believes that we should not seclude ourselves in the ivory tower, but contrary, we should invest our knowledge in the public memory debates. He is one of the main promoters of the so-called agonistic approach, which, in his opinion, is an effective instrument against subversive antagonistic discussions inside and outside the framework of nation state. Today, Professor Berger is going to tell us if the agonistic approach is applicable to the memory area of Eastern European post-socialist countries. The subject of his lecture, the memory of communism in Eastern Europe, antagonistic, cosmopolitan, agonistic, is highly intriguing. Before to give the floor to Professor Berger, I should remind the rule of our conference. We do not use the chat, and all questions you send using the Q&A. Dear Professor Berger, we look forward to your lecture.
Many thanks, Sergey, for that wonderful introduction, and many thanks for the conference organizers for inviting me to this event. Of course, I guess like everyone else, I would rather have traveled to Chisinau, but that, of course, at the moment is not possible. So we have to try and make the best of what we have available in terms of technology, and having in advance just talked to Misha and Sergey as well. I have been hearing that it's been working very well. I have to apologize that I have not been able to participate in the events of the conference because firstly, I've just returned from a holiday. Um, and secondly, because unfortunately, the deputy director of my institute here in Bochum has fallen seriously ill, which means that there are a lot of administrative things that at the moment I also have to take care of. Right. Now, I'm gonna try this morning to talk about the memory of communism in Eastern Europe. And I should say that this is not a subject that I'm really an expert in. I've written on many things, European labor movements, although even here, when talking about labor movements, I've mainly concentrated on the social democrat and socialists rather than the communists. I've certainly looked at questions of historiography and historical theory and nationalism, um, um, looked at the memory of war, in particular in a Horizon 2020 project. But I'm a little bit nervous to talk about the memory of communism because I'm sure there will be many in the audience who know a lot more about this than I do. But what I basically want to do, I think, see whether this works now with the PowerPoint. No, it does not work. How do I move from one slide to the next? Okay. What I want to do is talk a little bit about communism as a force determining the shape of the 20th century. And then after that, I would like to talk about the concept of agonistic memory, which I guess some of you might be familiar with, but I'm not sure whether all of you are. It, of course, goes back to a seminal article by my colleagues Anna Centobull and Hans Lauge Hansen that was published in Memory Studies, I think first in 2016. It was the basis of the theoretical basis of the Horizon 2020 project that I just mentioned, that I chaired between 2016 and 2019 on the memory of war in contemporary Europe. And I want to see whether and to what extent we can apply aspects of that theoretical frame to the memory of communism after the fall of communism. And I will talk a little bit about antagonistic forms of memory, which I think have been absolutely dominant in the memory discourses surrounding communism. I will talk also about forms of selective positive memory of communism in some of the post-communist states, and then move on to variants of cosmopolitan memory discourses before arriving at what I think are perhaps beginnings of an agonistic memory discourse on the memory of communism. And I will conclude with some thoughts about the future for the memory of communism in Eastern Europe. So that's what I intend to do. But I guess I'll start with the subject matter, the real subject matter, communism. And of course, communism is building on a long tradition of a labor movement from the 19th century that has been very critical of capitalism, of the capitalist system. I've got here a typical image of the 19th century labor movement illustrating this idea that capitalism was based on classes that are arranged in a hierarchical order and that ultimately are oppressing the workers. The workers are right at the bottom of that pyramid that you can see here. They're carrying the whole thing. So in line with much socialist thinking, the workers are the ones who are actually doing the work. And above them, the bourgeoisie, the military, the clergy, the aristocracy, the monarchy, they are just living off the products that are produced by the workers. And it is that tradition, of course, that communism also comes from. Now, we all know the seminal event for the history of communism was the Russian Revolution of 1917. Rather unexpected, of course. The socialists and the nascent communists did not expect the revolution to happen in Russia. Everyone expected it rather to happen in an advanced capitalist country. I think Germany, with the biggest socialist party committed officially at least to Marxism before 1914, was one of the places that many contemporary socialists expected the revolution to happen. Um, um, it did happen, of course, a little bit later, but when it happened, it emerged that many of those socialists were perhaps not as committed to the revolution as some others had thought in Europe before 1917. So Russia became the motherland of the communist revolution in the interwar period and afterwards, and everyone looked to Russia as the place where communism has first been put into practice. And of course, part of that communism was also communist internationalism, the idea that this was an international movement. Of course, that all goes back to one of the basic ideas also of Marxism, that workers had most in common with fellow workers internationally, and that other points of identification, such as nation or religion, were secondary to the class position of workers. The communist state in the Soviet Union and then the later communist states, of course, implemented various memory politics of their own, which rested on teleologies of emancipation. I've shown you here a very famous photograph from the Soviet Union, a typical pose that is reproduced in innumerable images in the communist world. The archetypal proletarian man and woman side by side. The eyes are going into the future. The optimism that the future is theirs, marching boldly into the future with hammer and sickle in their hands. So the teleologies of the Marxist-Leninist ideology that was at the bottom of the communist state is kind of illustrated by those kind of monuments and illustrations. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was able, on the back of the Red Army, to extend its influence to Eastern Europe. We all know that. And the role of the Soviet Union in this expansion of communism has also become one of the main bones of contention in debates surrounding communist memory after 1989. I've already mentioned that at the heart of the communist ideology was internationalism, but what we have seen first in the Soviet Union after the late 1920s, and then also in all of the communist states of Eastern Europe after the Second World War, is the emergence of various forms of communist nationalism. So in some respects and in most places, very traditional ideas about national identity were simply painted red by the communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe. So that we have not so much the replacement of nationalism by internationalism, but if you like, reframing of traditional nationalisms into communist nationalisms. Accompanying the establishment of communist regimes were various forms of dissidence that accompany the whole history of the communist regimes in the 20th century. And again, the role of the dissidents in those regimes will play an important role in the memorializations of communism after the fall of communism. I think it is also important to mention that the memory politics of the communist states was always deeply interrelated with the memory politics that happened in communist parties in Western Europe. Of course, we have very different parties here. We have real mass parties with a major political clout, in particular, of course, in France and Italy, whereas we have other countries where, at least in the trade union movement, if not in politics, the communist movement was also influential. I'm thinking of Britain here, where, of course, the Communist Party of Britain was always a very small affair, insignificant politically, you could say, whereas in the British trade union movement, communist union leaders were very influential at different times in the 20th century. And the interrelationship of those memory politics is, I think, an important part also of what is happening after the end of communism in 1989. Now, if we keep that in mind for a while, uh, I would like to introduce to you now, I'm not sure how necessary that is, you might all be very familiar with this, but for those who are not, to introduce to you the concept of agonistic memory, which was developed by Hansen and Bull in this article that I've already mentioned in Memory Studies. And they basically start from the assumption that you can identify three modes of memory, which they have called antagonistic memory, cosmopolitan memory, and agonistic memory. And these modes of memory function in different ways. If we start with antagonistic memory, antagonistic memory works from the assumption that you can identify good and evil in history as moral categories that are related to specific characters. The traditional form of antagonistic memory is nationalist memory, where you identify a good us, usually one's own nation state, and contrast it with an evil them, usually other nation states. There is a clear focus on heroes that are juxtaposed to villains. And of course, the heroes always come from one's own nation state. The villains come from other nation states. The antagonistic mode of memory tends to be unreflexive and highly monologic. It is talking to the us. It is very much a way of constructing an identity of the us via antagonisms to others. And in terms of the effects it mobilizes, they are usually passions of belonging. In the classic case, nationalism, belonging to a nation state. But of course, we can also think about our topic this morning, communism, and say that communism, of course, was also one of those ideologies that worked largely on an antagonistic mode of memory. Um, we have the proletariat as being good, and we have the capitalists or the kulaks as being evil. We have heroes that come from the working class world, and we have villains that come from the capitalist world. And it was arguably as unreflexive and monologic as nationalist modes of remembering. Now, Bull and Hansen make the point that their modes of remembrance are not less necessarily connected to time frames, that they are not talking about modes of remembrance that follow each other neatly. But of course, we can, looking back at the 19th and 20th century, or perhaps the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, clearly say that antagonistic modes of memory dominated the 19th and first half of the 20th century, whilst they were also never the only show in town. But the rise of cosmopolitan memory, and this is also something that they emphasize, the rise of cosmopolitan memory clearly comes after the end of the Second World War, and it is connected to the building of institutions such as the United Nations or the European Union in Europe. In some respects, this cosmopolitan mode of memory still rests on binary categories. It still rests on moral assumptions about good and evil. But these moral assumptions about good and evil are no longer related to ideologies, be they nationalism or communism, but rather they are related to, um, well, I guess you could also call them ideologies, but the good is usually associated with democratic forms of government and forms of humanitarianism, whereas the evil in cosmopolitan modes of memory is usually associated with totalitarianisms, i.e., the totalitarian theory assuming a certain form of equation between communism and fascism. The focus in cosmopolitan modes of remembering is on the suffering of the victims. So the focus is on victimhood, and the victimhood is something that is on the one hand denouncing the evil, and on the other hand underlining the call for more humanitarian, more democratic forms of government. We find, therefore, in cosmopolitan modes of remembering multi-perspectivity, because there is the assumption that there are different perspectives on memory, but it is a limited multi-perspectivity, because it generally does not include the perspectives of the perpetrators. Cosmopolitan memory is dialogic. It is not monologic like antagonistic memory, but it is aiming at consensus. It is set up in deliberative frames of democracy, usually associated with Jürgen Habermas. So in that sense, the effect that cosmopolitan modes of remembering work with best is compassion, usually compassion with the victims. And then finally, contrasting those two modes of remembering, Bull and Hansen argue that there is a third mode of remembering, an agonistic form of remembering, which is something that they very much wish to promote. And this agonistic mode of remembering, they argue, is rooted not so much in the binary constructions of good and evil, but is based on a thorough social and historical contextualizations of forms of conflict and violence. We could also say it is rooted in radical forms of historicization. That also means that the multi-perspectivity of agonistic memory is more radically multi-perspectival because it includes the perspectives in such conflicts and around particular violent events, not just of victims, but also of perpetrators and bystanders. Unlike in forms of deliberative democracy, agonistic modes of remembering are not aimed at presenting different perspectives in order to arrive at consensus, but agonistic forms of memory are open-endedly dialogic in the Bakhtinian sense of, in a way, conflicts that are not able to produce consensus. So there's a different assumption of politics behind these different forms of remembering. Deliberative forms of politics versus agonistic forms of politics that are, of course, mostly associated with the political theorist Chantal Mouffe and Bull and Hansen in developing this model of cultural memory are also building heavily on the work of Chantal Mouffe. So rather than trying to produce consensus, and in the argument of both Mouffe in terms of political theory as well as Hansen and Bull in terms of memory, um, this form of attempting to get to a consensus only means that once you have reached consensus, then there are people who are inside the consensus and people who are outside the consensus. And people who are outside the consensus do no longer represent a legitimate perspective. So they are no longer part of the discussion. Whereas the agonistic modes of remembering would try and avoid that and start from the assumption that there are always different perspectives that are also, it's not necessarily possible to reconcile those different perspectives. And therefore, the dialogue needs to be open-endedly dialogic and political. So one of the ideas behind this idea of agonistic memory is also the repoliticization of memory, because the charge is that cosmopolitan modes of remembering have been depoliticizing memory by, in a way, coming to consensual forms of remembering, which determine the right form of remembering and are working against the continuous discussion about what right forms of remembering might be. Whereas agonistic forms of remembering, in being open-endedly dialogic, are precisely repoliticizing memory. Looking at the effect basis, Bull and Hansen have argued that agonistic memory works with a passion of solidarity, between people, which also comes, I think, from a very specific commitment on the political left of the spectrum that Bull and Hansen share with Mouffe. So they're particularly interested in the memory of social movement, in the memories of anti-capitalism, and that is, I think, reflected in this overall model as well. So just very briefly, I hope this was clear what is involved in those different modes of remembering before we now try and apply those different modes of remembering to the memory of communism. And as I've already mentioned, in my own view, I think what has been absolutely dominant after the fall of communism, so from the 1990s onwards, although we can also talk about different stages, because after all, we're talking about 30 years now. But still, I would argue what has been absolutely dominant has been the antagonistic mode of remembering. We know that across Eastern Europe, what has happened is the institutionalization of memory through various commissions, institutes, and these commissions and institutes were themselves part and parcel of a strong memory politics that we find across the post-communist world. What has been in common in many of those memory discourses has been the externalizing of the enemy in antagonistic forms of memory. And the enemy was externalized to the Soviet Union. Russia was the big other of the post-communist antagonistic memory of communism. It was almost as though there had been no indigenous communists, and that all the communists were either Russian or puppets of Russia. I think we can see these kind of antagonistic forms of memory most clearly in specific museums in Eastern Europe, such as the museums of occupation in the Baltic states, but also here pictured in this slide, the House of Terror in Budapest, which seems to me the clearest example of a memory politics that is exculpating the nation and in a way blaming all the unfortunate events in the history of the 20th century on external forces, German fascism and Russian communism. This also comes often with an equation of communist and fascist guilt in those antagonistic memory discourses. The Gulag and the Holocaust are the two defining elements of 20th century European memory. This is an interpretation that is extremely present in the House of European History in Brussels, a relatively new museum dedicated to the construction of European identity through history, an interesting trend that the European Union has been taking up for a number of years now, I guess directly related to the political crisis that the Union finds itself in. There are clearly players in Brussels who are thinking to repeat what they regard as the success of nationalist memory politics in the 19th century by coming up with a contemporary variant of such a memory politics for the 21st century. Another characteristic of this antagonistic memory mode in relation to the memory of communism is that you have clear ideas of heroes and villains. The freedom fighters against communism are the heroes, and the communist occupants, preferably coming from a different nation than one's own nation, are the villains. That, of course, in many countries includes the rehabilitation of fascists. For example, some years ago when I visited the National History Museum of the Ukraine, I was shocked to see that someone like Pedlura was very much portrayed as a hero in this museum. And of course, his sort of anti-Semitism was not mentioned at all. At least at the time when I visited the museum. Continuing with this antagonistic memory, we can also see that communism is often portrayed in this memory politics and this antagonistic memory politics as a short diversion from the true national path of the respective nation states. So there has been an attempt to create a proud national history. And again, I think it is important to remember here that that attempt was never really broken, because the communist regimes were not breaking with the nationalist master narratives. They were simply painting them red, as I mentioned before. So in some respects, it was therefore easy for the post-communist regimes to build on the long history of nationalism, even under communism, and tweak the storylines to produce new forms of nationalism that we have, of course, seen almost everywhere, although to different extent and also with different content in the post-communist states of Eastern Europe. Most violently, of course, in the Yugoslav civil wars, and scholars who have worked on the Yugoslav civil wars have stressed how much the nationalism that flared into war and violence and ethnic cleansing and genocide during the Yugoslav wars was prepared by the strong nationalist narratives that were developed decades before in the different states that at that time made up the federal state of Yugoslavia. We also see a strong discourse in the antagonistic modes of remembering on Westernization. And these Westernization narratives often adopted the strong anti-communist memory discourses that were present in Western Europe during the Cold War. So it is almost something like a kind of, well, I guess in German we would say nachholende Modernisierung. So in terms of trying to become more Western than the West, the anti-communist memory discourses of the West were useful instruments in further creating strong binaries between a backward communist and a positively evaluated Western path towards modernity. The strong references to a return to Europe that we find in post-communist Eastern European states after 1989 contrasts to some extent with a memory politics that developed from the 2000s onwards, that is portraying the European Union as the new occupant of Eastern Europe. And I think this is an interesting part of the memory politics of Eastern Europe, how we have arrived in many of the post-communist European states at a situation where the dissident movements against communists were, especially in East Central Europe, were often portraying their dissidents and the changes that were happening in the late 1980s as the return of East Central Europe to Europe. And in the meantime, we have also seen strong tendencies to correct those kind of memory discourses and instead return to new binaries that see the East European post-communist nation states in opposition to an allegedly well, new villain in the form of Brussels or European bureaucracy. Part of that Westernization or accelerated Westernization in post-communist states was also the widespread acceptance of the interpretation of Francis Fukuyama of an end of history, 1989 marking an end of history, the ultimate triumph of liberal capitalism over all of its enemies, which would be perpetuated in the future. Of course, we have seen with at least the economic crisis in the years 2007-8 following, and I think we shall see with the social and economic crisis that will derive from Corona, how shallow that interpretation always has been. In terms of passions, I think we have also clearly seen antagonistic passions of memory in post-communist countries, especially the passions of assigning guilt to others and salvaging the self. I have here a picture from a demonstration of the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, the right-wing populist party in Germany that is particularly strong in post-communist East Germany. And we see here the poster, which is against Islamization, so Islam becoming the key other towards the kind of national self. And the debates in Germany around this topic are, of course, very viral and alive at the moment. Now, the antagonistic forms of memory portraying communism as the key other are dominant. But I think we also see in some countries a selective positive memory of communism, and that has a lot to do with strong personal continuities, I would argue, because we see in some countries, Russia obviously, but also Romania, that large parts of the old political elite, the communist elite, also forms the political elite in the post-communist scenarios. Stefan Tröbst, who has worked very widely on memory of post-communism in Eastern Europe, identified 4 memory regimes in post-communist Eastern Europe. And one of those four is one where he identified what he called ambiguity and apathy towards the communist past. And apart from Russia and Romania, he argued we can see this in particular in Bulgaria, Serbia, Macedonia, and Albania. And here we find a memory politics that is often albeit often selectively, positive about the memory of communism. We see this surrounding the official Russian memory discourses about the Second World War, even the kind of apologias for Stalinism. I've pictured here a bus in St. Petersburg around 2010, I think, with the proud picture of Stalin on it. And of course, connected to this positive memory of communism and Stalinism are the various temptations that we find across post-communist Eastern European states to produce authoritarian political orders. Again, countries like Belarus or Russia would be good examples of that. If we move then from antagonistic forms of memory to cosmopolitan forms of memory, then we see clearly that here the focus is indeed on remembering the victims of communism and contrasting those victims with the perpetrators. And the perpetrators often lack any three-dimensional shape. Problematic here is that some of these discourses on victims include right-wing, nationalist, anti-Semite, and fascist forces in different East European countries. There is a clear focus on resistance, and the resistance, the freedom fighters are the clear heroes, often associated with violent events such as 1956, or I could have also added 1968, and then of course the peaceful resistance of 1989, with various national variants. The role of Solidarność in Polish national memory clearly is a Polish phenomenon. Overall, I think there is an emphasis in the cosmopolitan memory of communism that this memory politics stresses that itself, the memory politics of the cosmopolitan memory politics of communism is one that lacks a utopian vision. Adam Michnik, in his own account of the fall of communism, has emphasized that the fall of communism had much to do with the desire for freedom, with the desire for political rights, with openness, also with truth, but that it lacked a kind of utopian element. And of course, this is also in direct contrast to the them in cosmopolitan memory communism, which is charged with precisely having such a utopian vision, and the utopian vision that ultimately produced the gulags. In line with cosmopolitan memory frames more generally, the cosmopolitan memory of communism is also one that stresses the need to establish a liberal order and contrasts the ongoing failure to do so in several of the post-communist East European states with a memory politics of victimhood that is allegedly seen as a powerful reminder of the need to move towards liberal humanitarian frames of politics. And then thirdly, we have communism as agonistic memory. And this is one which I think is at the moment not very prominent. It would seek to understand perpetrators as well as victims, and of course also bystanders. And generally, I think it would be a memory that blurs the lines between the two categories, between perpetrators and victims. And I think one of the best examples that I could think of in preparing this lecture is from Germany, the film Gundermann, which was screened, I think, last year or 2 years ago, maybe. Very few people of you will have heard of Gundermann. He was an East German singer, songwriter, who worked in the coal fields, the brown coal fields of the GDR. So he was a miner. And in some respects, he was the idealist, archetypal, organic intellectual of communist Eastern Europe. He was during the GDR someone who had joined the party, but had at several points also his difficulties with the parties, moving more towards dissident stances. But as emerged after reunification, he also worked for a brief period as a member of the Stasi. So he was successfully recruited to the Stasi. And I think the film uh, captures very well this life story, which seems to me representative of lives that do not neatly fit into this binary categorization of victim and perpetrator, but rather portray the everyday under communism in all of its complexities. And personal life histories, I think, are a good way of promoting such an agonistic memory. Because one of the characteristics, I think, certainly of the former GDR of East Germany, which is a special case amongst the post-communist countries of Eastern Europe, is that the takeover of West Germany, of East Germany, did not only result in the fact that East Germans had to get used to a completely new system practically overnight, but it also led to the devaluation of entire life histories that were lived under communism. And such devaluation then created memory wounds, to pick up a phrase that has been popularized by Dipesh Chakrabarty, in particular in family memory. And that also, I think, was one of the main reasons, or still is one of the main reasons, why there is so much friction in the unification process of Germany. And I would argue that agonistic forms of memory, by portraying and by radically historicizing the life stories of people living under communism, would be one way of bridging the ongoing divide, in this case, between the two Germanys. I think agonistic memory can also celebrate dissidence in these ambiguities. And I think it can also uphold visions of emancipatory social movements from below that were clearly present in many of the peaceful revolutions across Eastern Europe against communism around 1989. I think agonistic memory would also have to try to pluralize the memories of communism, to not try and restrict communism to a very two-dimensional idea of evil, but to also show how memories of communism in many respects retained emancipatory potential even under communist dictatorships. It is not uh, a coincidence, I would argue, that people like Gundermann in East Germany were always also attracted to the idea of communism. So agonistic forms of memory, through radically historicizing the past, and through also trying to show the ambiguities, would work towards a more playful and self-reflexive memorialization of the communist past. And it would seek, in particular, I would argue, to harness the passions of solidarity from below that were so present in the dissident movements towards communism. So finally, what future for the memory of communism in Eastern Europe? Clearly, we have, on the one hand, a strong official memory politics from above in many of the post-communist countries. But we also have, and we see this across those countries, I think, resistances from within civil society, or perhaps resistances would already be putting it in a too binary way, perhaps rather ambiguities or adaptations from civil society that do not quite fit the official memory politics, and that create dissonance between those forms of memory politics. All of this points to me to the fact that it seems pretty impossible to streamline one collective identity through memory politics, which I take as a hopeful sign for the memory politics of the future. I think doing away with competition and hierarchies between the memorialization of different victim groups would also be the consequence of a more agonistic approach to communist memory politics. Because this radical form of historicization that I've been talking about would not allow for binaries or hierarchies, but would rather look at the complexities of everyday life situations. Does communism have a space in the ongoing memory politics of anti-capitalism? Here pictured, poster capitalism isn't working, another world is possible. We clearly see a lot of anti-capitalism in the globalized world of today, with the Occupy movement, with the anti-globalization movement, but also with the Fridays for Future movements. And what is interesting to observe is that the memory of communism is almost completely absent in those contemporary anti-capitalist movements. But of course, communism was arguably the anti-capitalist movement of the 20th century. I think we need to ask ourselves whether the antagonistic memory politics surrounding communism isn't successful even with left-wing movements by completely eradicating the memory of communism from the long ongoing struggle against capitalism. Thank you very much for listening.
Dear Stefan, thank you very much for your very impressive lecture. We have 34 visitors of your lecture, and I think they're preparing questions. But to initiate the discussion, I prepared two questions. I ask you the first and then the second. The first, dear Professor Berger, my question is related to the concept of three antagonistic, cosmopolitan, and agonistic approach. You didn't discuss their spatial frameworks of solidarity. We know that antagonistic memory is first of all the memory of solidarity of nation state. Us is our nation, which is good, and others are other nations which are not good. In the framework of cosmopolitan memory, us are the entire humankind. It means the solidarity towards all people of the present and the past who were not perpetrators. And others are perpetrators of all times and nations. Who are us for the agonistic memory? Our nation state, as in the case of antagonistic memory, or the humankind of cosmopolitan memory, and who are others for agonistic memory?
Thanks very much, Sergey. It's an interesting question, but I guess, I mean, in my understanding of agonistic memory, it would try and evade the constructions of binaries of us and them. So it would not try and think in those binaries, but rather it would seek to understand the actors in the past in all of their complexity, i.e. this idea of radical historicization as the basis of a memory politics that does no longer differentiate between an us and a them, but that would take a political stance pretty much from a kind of decisionist perspective on a basis of particular ethical beliefs. And those political stances would not be based in any essences to do with collective identities, but would be political conflicts that need to be fought out in a political context.
Okay, thank you very much. And the second, my question is, in your opinion, what approach of memory politics does promote the European Union by establishing the European Day of Remembrance for victims of Stalinism and Nazism, and by forgetting to establish the European Day of Remembrance for victims of European liberal colonial regimes? Even for the 20th century, it means not very distant past. We have such examples of brutal atrocities as British concentration camps in Kenya and the so-called Congo Free State, where, in accordance with Raphael Lemkin, estimations, accordance with Raphael Lemkin estimations, Belgians colonizers killed about 75% of population. A Croatian researcher, Sanja Hrvatinčić, believes that the aim of that one-sided memory politics is absolving the hegemonic ideology neoliberal capitalism. What do you think about that selectivity of the old European democracies?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point. And I think whilst, of course, there have been huge efforts in and huge debates in many European former colonial states about the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, and obviously the sort of restitution of property that was robbed from colonized states. Um, and sort of I would first of all stress that we do have an ongoing debate that is, of course, given that we are talking about colonial nation states, often focused as a national debate, but does also have significant transnational elements. But I think you're quite right in saying that the dominant memory discourses about the 20th century in Europe, and those are also the ones promoted by the European Union. Any visit to the history, to the House of European History in Brussels will show that, are the ones that are focused on Hitler and Stalin, on fascism and communism. I think it is reflective of a fact that the European history that we have been practicing, and that is in many respects the basis for European memory, has been in the past a strongly Eurocentric history. And the widening of perspectives on European history by taking into account more transnational global perspectives, in a way paying due attention to the many meaningful interactions between Europe and the rest of the world in constituting Europe, would be one way also of inserting the memory of the non-European world into European memory discourses. And they are marginalized at the moment. I mean, there are sections of the House of European History in Brussels that also talk about the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, but they are nowhere near as important as the emphasis on the catastrophe, on the original catastrophe, the First World War, and then, of course, the memory of fascism and communism that are directly related to the original catastrophe in European 20th century history, all within a very much European frame. So I would say that in order to reintroduce that very important memory of colonialism and imperialism and the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, we also need to reconceptualize our understanding of European history and make that the basis of a new understanding of European forms of remembrance of the 20th century. It's also very interesting to reflect a bit on the moment that if we think about early anti-colonial and anti-imperialist theory, Hobson, J.A. Hobson, for example, then we find there invariably a strong connection between imperialism and capitalism. And that, of course, is also completely absent from memory discourses. There is no criticism at all, I would say, in the House of European History of capitalism. So capitalism is the unquestioned basis on which liberal memory discourses of the 20th century are taking place in contemporary Europe. And the left has been left largely speechless, I would say. And I would even argue that part of that is the dominance of cosmopolitan memory, having produced a consensus around what the memory of the 20th century should consist of. And it is the memory of totalitarianism. And this is contrasted with the memory of liberal capitalism, and liberal capitalism becomes the kind of positive other to totalitarianism, ignoring the many aspects of liberal capitalism that have been deeply problematical in the past and remain deeply problematical in the present.
Thank you very much. And we have some questions of our colleagues. Olga Malinova, my colleague from the Russia, ask you, as your research of museums demonstrates, the agonistic mode of remembrance till now is not really visible. I think that your lecture well explains why. As you demonstrated, two alternative modes are connected to clear ideological frames. Is radical historiorizing an equally handy tool of framing? Isn't too difficult for everyday practice?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Sorry, for some reason the system just threw me out for a couple of seconds, so I didn't hear the end of the question.
Isn't too difficult for everyday practice to apply agonistic mode of remembrance?
Is it too what? Is it too?
Too difficult for everyday practice, practice?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we've also in this project that I mentioned briefly on the memory of war in contemporary Europe talked to many museum curators, and their worry was often that putting agonistic memory into practice would be too complex, and it would, in a way, um, uh, ask too much of the museum visitor. But I'm not sure whether this is correct. And we had also many museum curators who were very interested in the notion of agonistic memory, and certainly interested enough to try and put it into practice. So my hope would be that those people making museums would try and insert at least perhaps agonistic elements into their museum displays in order to irritate people, museum visitors, more than they do at the moment, and perhaps being more successful in trying to make museum visitors rethink their own positions. We all know from research in museology how difficult that is. Much of that research seems to confirm that the messages that museum visitors take from museums correspond with the ideas that they already have when they visit the museum. So it is incredibly hard for museums to jumpstart processes of rethinking one's own positionality. But I think we do find those agonistic moments. We certainly found some of those agonistic moments in some of the museums we investigated to do with war. The National Army Museum in London and also the Bundeswehr Museum in Dresden are two museums where I think we identified particular instances where not the exhibition as a whole, but at least some elements within the exhibition had agonistic elements. And I'm not quite sure. I think when was it, 2 years ago, I visited what was then I think a relatively new museum in St. Petersburg on the political history of Russia in the 20th century, which I thought was also a very interesting element, and could be said even to contain some agonistic elements. For example, in the portrayal of different political forces in the Russian Revolution, which was very multi-perspectival and gave a lot of room to different voices in the Russian Revolution, without necessarily coming to some kind of synthesis, but leaving the visitor to the museum with those radical historicizations based on different perspectivalism. So I think it is possible for museum curators to introduce elements of agonism into the world of museums. And I have always tried when meeting stakeholders such as museum curators to make that point. And whether they will listen or not, I guess the future will show.
Thank you. Uh, the other colleague, Jute Hirschekorn, asked, could you please say more about the special case in Germany with East Germany and official memory politics? Is this still predominantly antagonistic, or is there more accommodation towards agonistic memory?
I think, well, it's a difficult question because there's so many aspects to the memory politics of Germany in relation to the communist GDR. I think I wrote an article in the mid-1990s on the memory of communism in the reunified Germany, which I entitled Anti-Communism After the Fall of Communism, where I argued that it is surprising to find how even the corpse of communism was still treated in an incredibly anti-communist way. So the anti-communist reflexes coming out of Germany from the Cold War, and arguably they were particularly strong in Germany during the Cold War, being a kind of border state in the Cold War, were very much alive and kicking, and I think also led to a coming to terms with the communist past in East Germany, which saw the radical denial of any worth that lives had under communism. It not only led to massive dismissals of people from public service. We only need to look at the universities and especially the humanities and social science in the universities, where hardly anyone survived the purges of the early 1990s in East Germany, which, as far as I can see, did not happen anywhere else in post-communist Eastern Europe. And the argument here was, first of all, that these people were scientifically not up to the standard of the West. So they were evaluated first scientifically, and then they were evaluated also according to their politics. And anyone who was an EM in German speak, an informeller Mitarbeiter, i.e. a member of the Stasi, was then also dismissed, which left hardly anyone still in the system, in the university system after those rounds of evaluation. So this set up, I think, a very antagonistic memory politics in the reunified Germany. And I think this is reflected in the very difficult process in Germany of the two Germanys finding together. And it's still reflected in the very different politics that we find in West Germany and East Germany today. Having said that, I think that there have also been introduced from the 2000s elements of strong cosmopolitan memory, remembering the victims of East German communism. And there have been many attempts also to introduce agonistic elements of memory. I mentioned the film Gundermann as, I think, a very good example of such agonistic memory, but there have also been a number of novels, other films, documentaries and movies that have been trying to work in this direction of not setting up easy binaries, of radically historicizing the past, of focusing on life histories and giving space for understanding those life histories, which move into the direction of an agonistic memory. And I would think that agonistic memory would be a very good basis of ultimately not so much unifying East and West Germany around a new consensus, but bringing out the differences and understanding the differences as the basis of a dialogue, a meaningful dialogue between East and West.
Thank you. Uh, Oksana Myshlovska asks, who are the primary actors that are promoting the move from binary to more multi-directional dimensional interpretations?
Well, also a very good question. I think that probably differs from country to country, but I think the actors that have been particularly prominent in the past are actors that coming from social movements, actors that coming from the key memory institutions in different societies, such as the already mentioned museums. Um, but also, of course, filmmakers, novelists, all the various agents that you have, the memory agents that are present in society. And as Sergei mentioned in his introduction, I very much see historians also as memory agents in these processes. So I think it's a motley mixture of different people and movements who have been trying to move towards those more radical forms of historicization. And we no doubt have to look very much at the specific circumstances in particular countries. I was very much aware in preparing my talk that I was talking in huge generalizations in part, and have no doubt often fail to do justice to the specifics that we find in particular situations and particular countries.
Thank you. Ksenia Robe asks, regarding the consistent evacuation of utopian energies from post-1989 memory, I was wondering whether you see utopian orientations or perhaps more optimistic engagements with the future in the emerging agonistic memory. What are the temporalities of these memories?
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are more optimistic future scenarios, even that we dare to think again, to think of visions of the futures that could be described as utopias. I think we see this very much in the movements that I've already mentioned, such as the anti-globalization movement, also the Fridays for Future movement. And I would think that the temporalities of that memory politics have not been worked out at the moment. Partly also because those movements themselves, for various reasons, I think, did not become prominent memory actors and probably underestimated the power of memory as a resource for those movements. quite interesting if we look at social movement studies, the development of the subfield of social movement studies, we see a recent trend of social movement scholars to work on memory politics, to make the connection between social movement studies and memory studies, a connection that has not been very strong until, say, 4 or 5 years ago. And I think this is also reflective of the fact that the movements themselves have been discovering memory as a resource in their struggles. And what will go into those memories, what will go into those memories that ultimately are the basis for the construction of positive utopias, is some things that we see currently being negotiated by many of those movements.
Thank you. You raised the James Mark asks, you raised the important issue of why the memory of communism doesn't inform global anti-capitalism, but doesn't East European memory politics influence in other ways beyond the region? Should we also consider how the memory of suffering under communism has become racialized as the suffering of marginalized white Europeans and deployed in populist anti-Islamic politics, which connects to an anti-Islamic memory politics across the world. For instance, how can agonistic memory really address such issues?
Okay, yes, very complex question. I'm not sure I understood all of the aspects of it. So the question, if I understand it correctly, was about the influence of post-communist memory politics on a global scale, arguing or putting forward the argument that we see in this post-communist memory politics the vilification of certain groups, such as Islam, which has a kind of global repercussion.
Yes, no, it's original question, I think.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure whether, I mean, the anti-Islamist sentiment, the Islamophobia that we are seeing across the Western world, is that something that genuinely connects to the post-communist memory, or is that something that is rather rooted in ideas of a Western modernity seeing itself challenged by Islam? So is it more connected to 9/11 than it is to post-communist memory? I'm not sure really whether post-communist memory is an important element in the memory politics of anti-Islamist or anti-Islamic rather forces. But maybe I've also not understood the question correctly. I mean, what we clearly find in post-communist memory politics and is also the kind of neglect, perhaps more than vilification, of a kind of white working class. I mean, if we look at deindustrialization processes in post-communist Eastern Europe, the demise of heavy industries, we see that the white working class had very few advocates in the official state apparatuses of Eastern Europe, partly because I think this white working class were the archetypal heroes of the communist past, the proletarians, and the steel workers and the miners were the archetypal proletarians. So the vilification of communism in these in these antagonistic memory discourses meant that when deindustrialization happened, and of course in post-communist Eastern Europe, it happened later, but far more quickly and far more radically than in many parts of the West. Not in all parts of the West. I mean, can't think of a more radical deindustrialization than in parts of the US or Britain. But still, I mean, when it happened, it had no, the white working class had no one to defend itself. And I think this is also why we see, at least partly, the white working class turning to right-wing populist politics. I read an interesting article recently, I forget the author, on, it will come back to me in a minute, I think, on Hungarian, on the Hungarian situation, where she argued that a lot of the white working class was supporters of Jobbik, because in a way the kind of social democratic neoliberal deindustrialization of Hungary after the fall of communism had left them completely disillusioned with this kind of left liberal approach to politics. And that, of course, we also see across the traditional northern areas of deindustrialization, whether it is support for Trump in the US or support for Brexit in Britain or support for the AfD in Germany or support for the Rassemblement National in France. The white working class that formerly perhaps voted socialist or communist is turning to right-wing populism. But I think I'm deviating very widely from the original question, so apologies.
Thank you. And Sabine Falk asks, how would you explain the right-wing turn of many former dissidents and their mobilization of the memory of communism in order to now explicitly denounce liberal governments, the European Union, as communist?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I have a very convincing answer for that. I think it would also be a matter of looking very specifically at who we are thinking about and why they have turned. I mean, the situation I perhaps know best is the East German situation, where of course many of the dissidents were very disappointed in the way that the reunification process was taking place in 1990 and the years following 1990. And this disillusionment, I think, remains deep-seated and has perhaps rather led to a withdrawal of many of those dissidents from an active political role. But I'm sure you're right that there are those who have turned also to more right-wing positions, and including perhaps in, especially in East Central and Eastern Europe, anti-EU positions. But I'm not sure I can answer this question in a kind of blanket way concerning all of the different dissident movements, because they're so different. And I think one of the most fascinating cases in that respect is arguably Poland, and the way in which the memory of Solidarność is kind of hijacked by sections of the contemporary peace party and its leaderships to justify a very right-wing sort of authoritarian, not only reconstructions of Poland itself, but also a strong kind of anti-European discourse that is based on this memory discourse of a dissident movement that I guess Solidarność always was very complex as a dissident movement in time, kind of saying whether it was right or left. I remember, I guess I'm old enough to remember the debates on the British left in the 1980s when I was living in Britain. And many on the British left, Tony Benn is the best example, was deeply suspicious of Solidarność as partly because it was Catholic, but also because it was already then perceived, at least by parts of the West European left, as being a very conservative, a very right-wing movement.
And there is another question of Sabine Falk. How should policymakers react to a right-wing mobilization of the memory of dissidents, for example, AfD in German, Wollende die Wende? I don't know what does it mean. Wollen die Wende.
Wollen die Wende? Do they want the change? I'm not sure.
It's in German. In German, I don't know how to read
Four
correctly.
words, yeah? Wollen die?
No, it's wollen die
Can I
Wende.
can I, can I see that in the question and answer thing? No, I don't think so.
No,
Hmm.
no, I think it's one of the slogans of AFD. Of AFD.
One of the slogans of the AFD, wollen die Wende? Well, I'm a bit lost here, lost in translation. But if we ignore the German for a moment, can you repeat the other question again?
How should policymakers react to a right-wing mobilization of the former of dissidents, exemplar gratia, the AFD, and after in German?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's been interesting if we look at the reception of the AfD amongst the more established German political class, because I think that it has so far really shown little willingness to engage politically with some of the key concerns that the AfD has been voicing in Germany, and that are also the key concerns of the voters for the AfD. Instead, it has been clearly trying to push the AfD in a position where you simply exclude it from any meaningful discussion. It kind of sort of resembles forms of cosmopolitan memory, that once you have reached conclusion, you depoliticize everything by saying only those who are inside the consensus, we will only talk to those. Anyone who's standing outside the consensus, we just refuse to talk to. And I think this is a very dangerous path to follow. Whilst there are clearly amongst the AfD fascists, and whilst I understand the argument by some people on the left saying, why should we talk to fascists? I think there are many amongst the voters of the AfD who are not fascists. And by failing to engage with right-wing populism, I think you are also letting down those voters. Just to give you one example from the area where I live in at the moment, the Ruhr, which is the former region of heavy industry in Germany, mining and steel, which is all in the past now, well, almost all in the past now. And it is an area which, after the Second World War, was strongly socialist. So the Social Democratic Party was the dominant party in the region from the 1960s until fairly recently. And in the last elections here, in the last elections to the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, of which the Ruhr is part, the AfD ran a poster campaign on which, and on some of the posters you saw a former councillor in the city of Essen, Guido Reil. And Reil, for 25 years, was a member of the Socialist Party, of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And he was a works councillor, a trade unionist. And he had left the SPD and joined the AfD. And you could see him on this poster in miners' garb, so in the traditional miners' dress, when they go underground. And the slogan said something like, at heart, a socialist, therefore AfD. So the AfD, at least in the Ruhr area, was clearly trying to claim the mantle of socialism in speaking for ordinary workers, in speaking for a white working class that felt left alone and left behind by the politics of the Social Democrats and by the traditional parties more generally, in a region where, particularly in the northern parts of the Ruhr, we have much higher unemployment than the rest of Germany. Gelsenkirchen, somewhere in the region of 16% unemployment. The national average is somewhere in the region of well, now with Corona, it has all changed, but before somewhere in the region of 5 or 6%. And I think politics needs to address those issues, which leads people to vote for the AfD. And that means engaging with the issues rather than saying, you're fascists, we're not talking to you, and we continue as normal.
Thank you very much for your interesting lecture and for interesting answers for questions. And now I should I should say that at 5 o'clock we have a business meeting of our PoSoCoMeS group, and we invite all people to make their suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much again for the invite, for listening, and for asking very interesting questions.